Welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom, and this here is Kaya. She is joining me in place because she does not have a craft book with her series, similar. She doesn't have a cookbook with her series. So in this case, we're going to be looking at this book called Indigenous Weaving, Knitting, and Basketry of the Pacific Northwest. The author is Elizabeth Hawkins. So this doesn't cover her people exactly. It does cover the Salish, which is a group of people that her tribe did interact with. But her people would have been a little bit further inland compared to these ones. It covers the interior Salish, the Katuni. This is mostly in Canada, but covers the Beaver tribe and a few other tribes. But again, these are going to be the materials and the well, not necessarily the traditions, but the modes of weaving and spinning would have been similar, because again, these tribes are relatively close together. So the plants, the animals that they would have been using would have been similar. Now, I believe I've mentioned this in one of her mysteries, where they knew this woman, the woman who they were trying to figure out where she was. They knew she was from the coast because she had shells on her clothing, so she would have dressed differently. But the modes of making mats and clothing and things would have been very similar. So they did use wool, but they weren't, none of these people were farmers, or they didn't have flocks. So they would occasionally kill sheep, but they didn't do that often to get the wool. Mostly the women would have gathered it from the plants when the sheep were shedding. So imagine shearing. It's like if you have animal basically using their shedded hair, and then they would card this and stuff. But of course there was a lot more of it. They also have these I think they said wool dogs. Let me see if I can find it in here, because it did mention them briefly. Yes, they have it shows the Salish wool dog. Let's see if I can, is it in there? Yes. They did mention, yes, they had Salish wool dog and the northern Tolton bear dog. And these are somewhat of a mystery to anthropology and biology. It's like, where did these come from? But mostly they were using barks and stems. Occasionally they would use goat. I'm assuming Kaya's people would also use the buffalo hides when they could get them, in various animal hides. But they might use the buffalo hides or buffalo tufts as part of weaving and making thread. So otherwise, they did use quite a lot of plant matter that they were able to gather, and various forms of cooking it and pounding it and stripping it to make it into fabric. Kay here is also wearing synthetic, but she would have been wearing more of animal hides. But again, these people would be wearing something similar. But this is specifically about the weaving. So it talks about the spinning and the dyeing of the clothing. And carding. If you're not familiar with what carding is they essentially take, the traditional way is you take two very wired brushes and you clean the wool and straighten it out. It's basically a process of cleaning it. And then it does talk about you have the single bar loom as well as the double bar loom. So, and it talks about how they would use each type of loom to make cloth and fabric. And then it talks about some of the different basic weaves that they would have used. And again, it's going to be very similar. This is pictures of some Salish weaving, which again, obviously it's going to be different with the tribes further inward, but the technique is going to be very similar, if not identical. So, but they would use different ways, and this book shows a lot of different forms. They would, this is a different tribe, tangent weaving. Again, the technique would be the same, the fabrics would have been different. Now this part talks a little bit about the ornamentation. Chaos people probably would have done that. They probably wouldn't have used as many shells, but they may have, just because of trading. Her books talk a lot about how when they would meet at the big salmon fishing grounds, there was a lot of trading going on. So, and knitting, it does mention, but it is a modern technique that was introduced by the early Scottish settlers to the Vancouver Island Indians. So the Salish now do it, but it wouldn't have been something that would have been around when Kea was young, or alive, period. So it does now here talk about, this is the basket making, the mat making, which is something that is mentioned in Kea's books. So again, the coarse mats were used for all sorts of things, for sleeping, for temporary shelters. Fine mat making was used for weaving or for clothing. So it also talks about basketry. This is mentioned frequently. They didn't use pottery, which kind of makes sense. They don't have the materials really, and the Pacific Northwest is wet. So in order to really make pottery, you have to have places where it can be very dry. So it's not going to be year-round areas of Washington. These coastal Northwest, even a little bit of the central areas, are relatively very wet. And Kea's people, or specific books, talk about they spend most of their times in the rivers, by the rivers and the mountains. So their pottery is not going to be a thing, because you really do need to be able to bake that, and you need to have the heat, and you need to be able to have stuff that's drier, and it's not going to be common among these people. So they would do most of their stuff with basket weaving, and they could probably do tight weaves in order to hold water, and they would probably also use leather. So, and it talks a lot about the different baskets and how they would weave them. This isn't a very long book. There's lots and lots of pictures in here. So, and it does have a, this is Hancock House Publishers. So it's Canadian, which is probably a reason they don't have a lot of stuff for the Nimi-Poo, because the Nimi-Poo were a little bit further south. But this still is a good book. It's simple. It shows a lot of the weaving. It talks about the history of these people. And again, the techniques are going to be similar here. I didn't want to use, it was hard for me to find something, and I didn't want to use stuff from, a lot of the stuff that you can find is from the American Southwest, which is different from, say, Kea's people and their pottery work and their weaving, because again, completely different environment there. So this is the closest I could get, and I wanted to do something that was related to craft books for Kea's series, because that is what a lot of the other dolls have. They have various different crafting books. So very good book, very simple, very short. If you're looking into Native American weaving and techniques and their history, this is a great book to have, particularly if there's anybody here who watches from Canada. These are a lot of the Canadian tribes. They do obviously along the Pacific coast, but a lot of this talks about the Canadians, but Canadian First Nation people. So, but for some, yeah. But again, that's the reason it's saying Indigenous. But again, a lot of the techniques and stuff and the wildlife is going to be very similar, just further south, which is where Kea's people are. Again, they worked with the Salish. They probably worked with some of these other tribes, depending on trading partners. The Salish is really the only ones that they mention in her book, so I'm not positive more on that. I do know that they mentioned the Clair de Lune, which is more northern Idaho, that were not friendly with their tribe. So that's all I can think of as the top of my head. So great book, highly recommended if you're looking for that kind of traditional. It's not very long. It's a very short little book. But I find it very interesting. Hopefully I can read through a little bit more of it. I'm very, very interested in spinning and weaving and sewing crafts. One of these days I'll get to it. I do in fact have a sewing machine, and I'm trying to make something for one of Sari's dolls, but nonetheless. So if you like what you see, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll be doing, Kaya is present here. This is being filmed on the 27th of December. So you guys will be seeing this in the next couple of weeks. So I've been trying to get Kaya's videos done for the month of January, and then we'll be moving to the other side of the country into a completely different area. We're going to be talking about the American Revolution with Miss Felicity. So thank you, and I will see you next time.